The Amber Mack Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.
On this week's show, we talk about how the dark side of digital is shaping Canada's federal election, everything you need to know about deepfakes and the law, where the next generation is actually spending the most time online, and we dive into Discord and your kids. Hey, Jeff, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited for our week leading up to a pretty historic election here in Canada. So I'm going to talk a bit about the online landscape for that. But first, let's get to the news.
News feed.
Jeff, first up, we're going to talk about Discord, which is a voice, video, and text chatting app that is especially popular with gamers and young people. And we're going to chat about how they are adapting in the face of complaints in terms of them being really poor insofar as protecting kids. This includes a couple of high-profile cases that I was reading about recently in two different U.S. states in terms of men luring younger girls. And the list of things goes on and on.
Yeah, in fact, the state of New Jersey is actually suing Discord for failing to protect kids. The platform, as we may remember, this is the platform that was used by a mass shooter in Buffalo to live stream his rampage on Discord after previously discussing it on Discord in the lead up to the attack. And there are complaints that the company isn't even using the tools it has available to effectively keep younger users safe.
It is really discouraging to see the growing issues on this platform. I was also reading over on BBC that Discord has about 200 million monthly users, so a massive number of people. Now, what's interesting in terms of what they are trying to do to be able to keep people a little bit safer is that they are actually testing face scanning to verify user age. Now, this is interesting because I didn't realize this, and something I just read about, that in the UK, there must be laws in place that are relatively new about online safety in terms of platforms with any adult content. Those platforms by July will need to have some sort of age verification in place. So this is an example of that potentially happening, but who knows how effective that's going to be.
And I think they're testing it both in the UK and Australia. UK has been actually really taking a strong stance lately about, I think with the new government there and stuff like that, they've really been trying to make these things work better and protect kids and all the things we want to see happen online. And Instagram actually brought in, I think in 2022, brought in some facial recognition thing. That one was geared at when you would change your account from being a kid's account to an adult account at 18. They were using that kind of AI detection. So we'll see if that becomes the norm, because for really obvious reasons, it's important that we be able to manage age restrictions online. They're there for a reason.
I was just speaking at a school, and there was a parent there who said that their daughter was actually essentially kicked off TikTok because the AI verified that she appeared to be too young to be using the platform in the first place. So I think this topic of age verification is absolutely going to be one that we're going to hear a lot more about. And in fact, on last week's show, Ed Elson also brought this up. So it would be great to see some progress in this area, because too many of our kids are at risk. Now, Jeff, we're going to switch gears a little bit. Here is a story that you found that is really an interesting approach to winning the lottery.
Yeah, this is absolutely nuts. So it's based on the fairly intuitive notion that one way to win a lottery would be to just buy every possible combination of numbers. And so this is what a London banker turned bookmaker worked with some associates to do. They purchased lottery terminals so that they could brute force their odds of winning by printing lottery tickets nonstop for 3 days until they were able to produce over 99%, I think it was 99.3% or something like that, of the number combinations for the contest. And it worked. They eventually won $95 million in a Texas lottery by printing off $26 million worth of tickets. So they've got like a $60 million profit just by totally brute forcing their approach to winning the lottery. So if somebody else gets the same number, I think they have to split that. But in any case, what an unusual thing to actually have the power to do these days.
Well, obviously they have a lot of time and money on their hands because the
Yeah.
average person couldn't do something like that. So that is pretty impressive. Definitely wild news. In other news, a federal judge in Virginia has ruled that Google has built an illegal monopoly with its advertising business. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I don't find that too surprising. And it comes after last year's ruling that Google illegally monopolized online search, and 2023's finding that the Google App Store was an illegal monopoly. I'm going to talk about this on a future The Other Mac because it's happening all over the place. We've got Meta in court about it right now, so we'll see what happens with that. But all in all, I'm pretty happy that the states have finally pulled off their blinders about the power that's being accumulated by some of these tech giants over time. So I see it as a good move. Let's let the legal system take its course. But for too long, they were just not making intelligent decisions about this. People who didn't know enough about what they were talking about, back when they let Meta buy Instagram and WhatsApp and all this. So I got to see this as progress.
Yeah, it absolutely does seem like progress. And I think you're right. We're starting to see more and more that some of these big tech companies are being held accountable. I think it's just starting. We have a long way to go. And speaking of some of these tech giants, there have been a number of reports that OpenAI is building a social network that could potentially compete with X. For people who aren't familiar with OpenAI, they are, of course, the makers of ChatGPT. The social network that they potentially could build could be a place where people would actually be able to post ChatGPT generated images that are created by users. So those would be AI images. I don't know, Jeff, at first glance, this seems sort of ridiculous. What do you think?
Yeah, I certainly don't think we need many more social media networks out there. I think this is a way to promote ChatGPT's image making capabilities, which are impressive. ChatGPT also has been doing some interesting stuff lately with reverse image, using images to try to guess where the location the image was taken in, which is really impressive. So there's interesting things going on there. But with this sort of thing where they're potentially looking to recreate a social media network, I think probably the motivation for this is to create a source for real-time user data that they can use to train their AI. And obviously their competitors like Meta and Google and X all have access to a huge amount of data like that. So if I were trying to figure out why would this make any sense, it's promoting the AI images, but then probably more importantly, just getting people to opt in to given their data to OpenAI so that it can train their AI, since they're getting further pushback against that.
This is a big topic out there. I know often when I speak at events, people will ask me, what do you think about some of these big tech companies that are training all of these AI models on content where they didn't have consent necessarily to actually train on that content? And in fact, the godfather of AI, who is a British Canadian, Jeffrey Hinton, who many people probably have heard of, he recently told the Toronto Star that he thinks that big tech companies need to pay more for training data, and basically saying that what is happening right now is having a negative effect on creative industries.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a musician and a composer, I can certainly relate to that directly. I have lots of artist friends who are seeing their work disappear as AI takes over the the creative efforts that they used to do themselves. So it's a bit terrifying. And it's kind of stunning to think that the tech giants feel that they should be able to create an AI to replace artists by training that AI on those artists' work and then not compensating those artists. It's mind-boggling that these people who have so much money to put into these efforts refuse to spend it on compensating people whose livelihoods they are taken away through this sort of stuff. So all in all, I see this as just more billionaire tech bro culture combined with a dangerously outsized political influence.
Absolutely. Well, up next in the other Mac, Jeff will discuss a different kind of political influence as Canadians face misinformation and disinformation as we approach this month's federal election.
The Other Mac.
Canada's in the midst of our 45th federal election, and it takes place amongst enormous efforts by insincere people to influence your vote. You've probably seen AI-generated videos of Canadian political leaders backing crypto scams or associating with Jeffrey Epstein types or other disinformation efforts. And Trump's outrageous behavior in the United States makes it hard to rely on past norms to judge the legitimacy of some news stories these days. The rise of influencer culture has also enticed people to get information from figures without the appropriate experience, knowledge, or ethical standards to be trusted, as is evidenced right here in Canada by Quebec influencer Lauren Chen, allegedly accepting $10 million from Russia to disseminate pro-Russian views during last year's US election. And as reported in The Guardian, more than half of Canadians still say they get their political news from Facebook, despite the platform's ban on news articles from reputable outlets. In fact, this is the first federal election in which Canadian news is not permitted to be shared on Meta's Facebook, WeChat, or Instagram. And while I wholeheartedly blame Canada's federal Liberal Party's Bill C-18 Online News Act for bringing in the pointless law that led to this, it's hard not to criticize how Meta has let this devolve even further. As Kevin Newman, a recent guest on the Amber Mac Show, explained, it's now easier in Canada to post fake ads impersonating the CBC than it is to share a story directly from the CBC on Facebook. Blue Sky's head of trust and safety, Aaron Rodericks, recently wrote in Maclean's that it's chilling how effective repetition is. Research shows it takes about 6 exposures for a message to sink in. So if someone keeps saying the election was stolen, even without evidence, some people begin to absorb it as the truth. And worse, if you try to debunk it too aggressively, it can have a backlash effect because people feel they're being attacked. So while misinformation and disinformation are not going away, especially in the face of generative AI and things like that, the knowledge that China and Russian, India, and others are trying to influence Canadian elections, if you're a Canadian wanting to cast an educated vote in the upcoming election, there are some simple things you can do to guard against malicious influence and disinformation. First of all, go to each of the federal parties' websites. Find those via Google search, not clicking on an ad you happen across to make sure it's the right one, and read their platforms. See where the leaders or candidates for your riding are on social media and look at what they're saying firsthand on their accounts without getting too lost in the comments, which are full of bots and other things like that. And don't give up hope on legacy media. The Globe and Mail, for example, Canada's national newspaper of record with roots going back to the mid-1800s, doesn't have a partisan agenda and can be relied upon to present different sides of a story. Finally, watch the leadership debates. Judge people on what you see them saying in an environment where they can be challenged directly. And maybe most importantly, if you see something suspicious online, report it. And certainly don't share it just because it makes your team look better. Politics is not sports. It has major consequences, so be responsible. In my opinion, blind partisanship is part of what's brought Canada to its weakest point in recent memory, and we don't need to indulge in the zero-sum game that is destroying our neighbor and friend to the south. So if you want to do something to be proud of as a Canadian, let it be your own behavior and fulfilling your duty to your fellow citizens to responsibly educate yourself this election and make decisions based on real people, real policies, and real patriotism, because real Canadians deserve it. I'm the Other Mac. Thanks for doing your part.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And coming up, the state of Canadians online and which site is the most popular for news among the next generation.
The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.
We talk a lot about online harms in Canada, but now we also have some recent data to back up what we're seeing in the digital space. Amber spoke to Angus Lockhart, Senior Policy Analyst at the DAIS, who is also one of the authors of the Survey of Online Harms in Canada. Here's their conversation.
Media Matters.
I am so looking forward to speaking with Angus Lockhart, who is Senior Policy Analyst at the DAIS. Angus, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me here.
Okay, so before we get started and talking about online harms in Canada, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what you do at the dais, just to give this conversation some context.
Yeah, so the DAIS is a think tank that's part of Toronto Metropolitan University. Our research is really at the intersection of technology, democracy, and the economy. So anywhere any of those intersect, that's where we do most of our work.
Now, you have done a number of surveys that focus on online harms in Canada. The most recent is from 2024. So, before we get into some of the findings, what is the goal of this survey?
The survey started in 2019 um, as we saw a rising presence of harm online, anything from hate speech to misinformation, disinformation, harassment, identity theft. Sort of everything was growing throughout the 2010s, and in 2019 we decided to start tracking it in the Canadian context. And so more or less every year since then we've been doing a survey of Canadians, asking questions in three broad areas. So where are they spending their time online? What does the media ecosystem online look like? What are they seeing online? How prevalent are the different harms? And then how they think the internet should be regulated. So what they think government's role in this is, and how best government can sort of try to improve the state of play.
As someone who has been reporting on online harms over the years and written a book on this topic, I think it's fair to say that we have really lacked Canadian data over the years. So it's great to see this focus specifically on Canadians. When you look at the survey from last year, what do you think are some of the most notable findings?
I think there was a pretty clear and simple story last year. So, what we found is that online harms are extremely prevalent in Canada. When we look at any of the harms we measured, so anything from misinformation to hate speech to harassment, about two-thirds of Canadians see that online somewhere. About a quarter see it online every week for any one of those categories. And then when you ask about people's experience, about 10% of Canadians say they've actually been targeted by hate speech, targeted by harassment online. So we've seen that consistently, all of these have been extremely prevalent in Canada. And when I say consistent, I mean going back to 2019, all of the harms have stayed just about as present or they've gone up. Things like deepfakes have only become more common online. So the state of play right now, the state of affairs is not good, and Canadians are experiencing quite a lot of harm online. And they don't trust the platforms to solve it, which I think makes sense given that these have been around for quite a while and nothing has really been done. We haven't seen any improvements. So Canadians aren't expecting places like Facebook or Instagram to get any better on their own. Instead, they want the government to do something about it. They want the government to act. Support for some policies that the government could implement are as high as 90%. So there's strong consensus in Canada for action on this.
Let's dive into that detail in terms of some of the places where we're seeing the most online harm. You mentioned Meta, of course, the owners of Facebook and Instagram. And I think that was one thing that was notable to me on these platforms is that there is often a conversation that those platforms are places for older Canadians. But I think what we saw reflected in this, and when you talk specifically about people between the ages of 16 and 29, one of the top platforms for them continues to be Instagram. So, can you speak a little bit about those places where Canadians are spending the most amount of their time?
Yeah, so like you said, Meta-owned platforms really dominate people's internet use habits. Facebook is still the most used platform, sort of on a daily basis. Facebook Messenger, which is slight offshoot, also extremely common. Both those platforms are obviously most common among older demographics, but young people still sort of a majority of the youngest cohort are using platforms like Facebook and Facebook Messenger. Instagram is also incredibly common. And WhatsApp, another Facebook owned platform, is only getting more and more common in terms of daily usage. And then some other platforms like YouTube round out the most common places people are spending their time online.
I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of government because I realize that's not your role. But one of the questions I have that runs through my head on a daily basis is why do we allow these US companies to come into the country, operate here without any guardrails, and in many instances, tear our communities apart?
So far, that's mostly just been a case of the government hasn't been able to get anything fully passed. So obviously, the Liberal government over the last year has really struggled to make any headway in Parliament. And they had a bill in place that would have helped this, the Online Harms Act. And there was a lot of hope that that would come into effect after many years of sort of drafting and discussing. But unfortunately, everything stalled, and that was on the agenda, and it got stalled out. And so we're sort of going back to square one. Hopefully, long term, Canada is able to implement some form of legislation. There's a strong demand for it. People don't want these companies to be allowed to run amok and sort of regulate themselves however they want. But to now, that's mostly just how it's been.
I do want to talk about some possible solutions in the months and years to come, but I also want to dive into some of the findings insofar as misinformation and disinformation, because I think we're seeing that right now as we are in the middle of a federal election. We know that Canadians are not getting actual news because it's blocked within those meta platforms. And yet we also know that those are the places that they're going for their news. And then if we can add a layer on top of that, there is misinformation and disinformation, and in some cases, deep fakes that are spreading across those platforms. And even within the ad networks, those are advertisements that are paid for by organizations. So, what would you say to this in terms of this perfect storm that we have right now in the digital space in the midst of an election like we have today?
Yeah, obviously, the fact that Facebook has limited access to news on, or that Meta's limited access to news on Facebook and Instagram is a problem. What other researchers have found is that a lot of sort of major news publications in Canada have seen their traffic from these platforms decline 90% plus. So it's been pretty devastating to people on Facebook's ability to get news from publications like the CBC and the Globe and Mail. But what we've found in our work is that there's been no decline in people who say they get their news from Facebook. So even though major news publications are no longer allowed on those networks, people are still finding some kind of news there. And it's just different news, right? So it's just news from either secondhand sources who are discussing it and maybe putting their own spin on it, or it's news from less reputable news sources, or it's just outright fabrications, deepfakes, things that aren't real. So there's obviously a perfect storm coming sort of from both sides, where lots of people are relying on Facebook and Instagram for news, and they're increasingly bad sources of it.
As you mentioned, you're in the fifth iteration of this report, and I imagine over the years some things have changed, but generally speaking, like you mentioned, in some cases things have gotten worse. What do you think the fallout is from this in terms of how it affects Canadians?
Yeah, so if it becomes harder to find news and reputable news, we'll see a huge increase in mis and disinformation and a huge decrease in trust. So one of the biggest issues that we found in this survey is that the people who believe the most mis and disinformation are the least trustful of sort of general news sources, of places like government, of places like the media, to give them information. And so the more you believe mis and disinformation, the harder it's going to be to actually pull you back or to give you the news as it actually is.
Let's talk about another platform that is mentioned within this survey, and that is TikTok. Now, there has been so much attention directed at TikTok over the past few months. A lot of people, even in this survey, saying that TikTok should be banned in Canada. But when you look at the actual harms and the places where we're seeing the most hate and the most misinformation and disinformation, how does TikTok actually fare based on the data?
Yeah, there's two ways of looking at it. So the first way is that if you compare TikTok to other social platforms, it really doesn't look too bad. In terms of belief in mis and disinformation, TikTok is sort of middle of the pack for social media platforms. So people who are on TikTok are no more likely to believe mis and disinformation than people who are on Facebook or people who are on Twitter. But I don't think that that's the best benchmark. When you look at everyone, and so people who aren't on these platforms, TikTok is associated with higher than average belief in misinformation. It's just that all social media platforms tend to be associated with higher belief in misinformation. So there's nothing particular about TikTok that's associated with, extra disinformation, but use of any of these social platforms, especially as news sources, tends to lead you down a path of believing some form of misinformation.
Now, there was a time here in Canada, and I remember this because I've been an avid user of social media for, I'd say, 2 decades now. And there was a point where if you were harassed or bullied on Twitter at the time, or you had someone impersonating you within the meta platforms on Facebook or Instagram, there was recourse. There were people you could go to, there were teams that were there to protect users. But we're starting to see this absolute decline in terms of accountability on behalf of these social media networks, including just this year with Meta announcing that they were getting rid of fact checkers. What do you think this is going to do to this next round of surveys that you're going to have in the coming years as far as the results?
Yeah, the platforms used to have um, much more, they used to put a lot more effort into moderating themselves and ensuring the content on themselves was better. It never really pulled through in the numbers. It was always true that social media platforms were sort of bad news sources and hotspots of hate speech. But in recent months, largely since the shift in tone has happened down in the States, the shift up here has been sort of equal. And so these platforms are less well regulated, less well moderated than they used to be. It's possible that with the platforms pulling back and the government having done nothing to sort of step in that place and require any form of moderation, that the platforms will see an increase in things like hate speech and targeted harassment. Um, Sort of remains to be seen. And hopefully the government does step in, and so we won't have to worry about it.
What do you think the delay is? This is not a new problem. Like you mentioned, there were some steps made last year, but we certainly haven't made any progress. Is it that the big tech companies are too powerful? Is it that the government just doesn't have their act together on that front? We know Canadians want this in terms of regulation. So, what exactly is happening that's taking us so much time to lead in this area?
Yeah, I think there's two problems. The first is that government hasn't made it a priority. So, despite the fact that it's widespread and sort of ever omnipresent in Canada, government hasn't actually put this at the top of their priority list. And so it means that legislation takes longer to pass and they put other things ahead of it. And so you just need to wait for time in the docket to appear. And that time ran out. And so here we are, sort of back at square one. The other issue is the vocal minority who support free speech above all. So, in most cases, what protections against online harms mean is some form of content moderation on platforms. And every time you're doing that, you're going to offend the people who are free speech advocates and absolute free speech advocates. So there's a large vocal minority in Canada who will, in any of these situations, come out and oppose any sort of efforts to require platforms to take down content of any kind on the grounds that they have a right to free speech. Our survey has found that that is a minority of Canadians, that consistently at least 2/3 of Canadians support regulation of platforms and sort of protection of people in Canada over an absolute right to free speech. But that vocal minority does make it a lot harder for government to act quickly.
So I want to go back to something you said at the beginning of that statement. You said that government hasn't really made it a priority. Why do you think that is? Because the data has been pointing in the same direction for many, many years. And I'm sorry if I seem frustrated. In 2016, I wrote a book on this topic. That's a long time ago. We've known that this is a growing issue. So is it that in government we just don't have people who maybe understand the extent of the problem, or is it just sort of malaise in terms of being slow to adapt?
I think it falls more so in that second category. I'm sort of an optimist that these people do understand the problem. And from what I've seen, lots of people within government do. Um, it's just a very hard thing to keep up with, a hard thing to decide how to appropriately regulate it, and a hard thing to try to find consensus on because there are so many people who have so many different beliefs. And you do run sort of the risk of limiting people's free speech in a way that isn't necessary. And so I think it is a challenging issue, but it is something that if we can move it up the agenda of the next government, whoever that might be, hopefully we can see some action on.
What would that action look like in a perfect scenario? If some changes were made, what can we learn from other countries who've made more progress on this front? What do we know based on your research that could be done while protecting free speech, but also protecting online users, especially the next generation?
Yeah, the place where you have a lot of consensus on what should be done is protecting children. Generally, across the board, most people think that children are underprotected online and that they think that there is clear room to do things to protect children. The thing that we tested that's most popular in Canada is requiring platforms to quickly remove any child sexual abuse material and report it to the police, which is sort of astonishing that platforms aren't already required to do that. Um, but anything related to protecting children online tends to be more popular. The other area is protecting people from non-consensual intimate images. So in general, that should be more heavily regulated. But in particular, with the rise of deepfakes and the rise of deepfaked non-consensual intimate images, there's a huge need for platforms to be required to take this down and limit the spread of this content.
And when we look to the future, I think it is reassuring. Certainly, I've heard at least one of the leaders speak about this very issue, which was refreshing during a federal election, knowing that, again, this is more of a priority. But when we look at the future of potentially having solutions on this front, we would inevitably need Meta to be able to cooperate, as just one example, as well as other
Mhm.
social media platforms. What are the chances that they will, based on the fact that they certainly didn't cave at all in terms of the request to support local news and journalism? How likely is it that they will be supportive of some of these initiatives?
Yeah, it's a really tricky situation for Canada because we are a small market. And so, for instance, in the case of the news ban, Meta made the calculation, and they were probably right about it, that people wouldn't care enough about it and they could just ban news platforms on their website without affecting their own traffic and without having to pay out anyone. And so, Canada being a small market, I think the most obvious thing is that we won't be able to do this alone. If we want any kind of power to force platforms to do things, we should look to other models that have already been more effective and look to other jurisdictions that have larger populations that we can sort of line up with. And so the most obvious case is Europe, which has been miles ahead of Canada for a decade now in regulating the internet and try to develop a regime that at least in part looks like the European regime so that we have more bargaining power and so that the platforms are more likely to cooperate because they're already having to do it over in Europe.
We also have someone on this episode who is talking about the legal side of things in terms of deep fakes and what victims can do. So, really grateful that we're able to address that in this episode. When we look to the legal side of things and the recourse that individuals can take in terms of being victims of things like deep fakes, it also brings to question some of the advertisements that we're seeing across these social media platforms because I'm not a lawyer, but I would expect that with some of these deep fakes that are masquerading as political ads that are misconstruing people's images and likeness, there are actually laws in Canada to prevent that from happening. So, what do you think about that situation? Sort of the laws that we currently have in place are just blatantly being broken pretty much on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think that that's obviously an issue. We do some work with an organization called Who Targets Me, which is an organization based out of the UK that does some really interesting work related to advertising and especially advertising on Facebook during elections. And so they've done some work to try to find and spot parties using deepfakes in their advertisement. And what they found is that there's very little of that so far, thankfully. Insofar as it's happening, it's very much a fringe behavior. And so, at least when we're talking about the political parties, we seem to mostly be in a pre-deepfake era. We haven't seen parties use it in any kind of malicious way, through advertising. That said, a lot of advertisers are not well regulated. If you look at advertisements on X, the quality of advertisements on X have declined dramatically since a lot of large advertisers pulled out. And so it's really easy to imagine that people are using platforms like X to spread deepfaked content and misinformation throughout the election with very little oversight.
I know this is hard to answer, but if we don't get this right, if we fail to introduce any type of legislation around keeping people safer online, what do you think the long term effects are on Canadians?
The biggest long-term effect that we at the dais are concerned about is the general erosion of trust in institutions. It's something that I think we've seen pretty dramatically over the last decade or so, particularly in the United States, but also in Canada. People are much less trusting of government and of the media. And all of these online harms, but especially mis and disinformation and deepfakes, are only going to accelerate that decline in trust over time. And if you lose people on trust, you're not going to be able to pick them up anywhere else.
Now, just for my final question, because one of the things I try to do on the show is to ensure we have practical things that individuals can do to protect themselves online. And I realize that's not the area of focus of this particular survey. But what would you say to people who are listening to this, who are feeling overwhelmed, who are worried about some of the issues we've talked about today? What can they do until they have their governments looking after them to be able to stay safer in those online spaces?
Yeah, a couple sort of very generic pieces of advice would be one, liberally use the block button on these platforms. They are required to allow you to block people, and that is one of the most effective ways at limiting sort of the ability of other people to target you with hate speech and with any kind of harassment. So block people at any time for almost no reason to limit your exposure to that. And the second is something that's been said many times, but make sure to fact check everything you see online. Go directly to news publications, the places that you know you can trust information. So try to get your news from newspapers, try to get your news from news websites, from the radio, from television, and don't just rely on news coming across your TikTok feed or your Instagram feed, because that's the place that actual news is, and that's the place that you know you can trust what you're seeing.
Absolutely. For people who want to check out the survey and follow along with any future surveys, where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, our website is dais.ca, dais.ca, and you can find all of our reports and our sign up for our newsletter there.
Excellent. Well, listen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Angus and Amber. Up next, and speaking of the rise in deepfakes, we break down the actual laws here in Canada that are lagging a bit behind the rest of the world.
You're listening to The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.
We know deepfakes are on the rise in election ads and beyond. To further understand this growing issue, Amber has some thoughts in this short essay to set up her conversation with Karina Chu, partner, litigation and dispute resolution at Macmillan.
Talking Tech.
The internet these days feels a little bit like the HBO series The Last of Us, but the infected online are the trolls, and the rest of us are like Joel Miller trying to protect Greta Thunberg, the one person who might save our future. Just like the infected are at different stages of infection, today's trolls are at a dangerous stage of trolling, thanks to increasingly cheap and accessible deepfake software, which is far more worrisome than writing fake essays with ChatGPT and AI-generated photos winning contests. Deepfakes seemed fun at first. I loved watching the fake Tom Cruise do magic, and checking out Unreal Keanu dressed up like a cool guy. But I don't love this fact. Today, 90% of deepfake videos are non-consensual porn featuring women. As one of these victims says, this is literally a nightmare. Today, we are living in a post-truth world. Seeing isn't believing. Now, we could use this software to showcase corporate greed, but that would be like living on the internet in 2003. We're now in the internet world of 2025, and the deepfake game is dark and dirty. According to The Hub, you don't have to be a high-profile public figure to be a target. With their increasing ease of use, these deepfakes are being used to shame, silence, and victimize women regardless of stature or status. There are few laws in place to protect women and other victims of deepfake porn, and big tech companies make it easy to amplify these videos and the apps behind them. As a writer in The Guardian shares, we are not ready for this assault on consent. To learn more about the laws today in Canada to protect victims of deepfakes, I caught up with Karina Chu, partner, litigation and dispute resolution at Macmillan. I saw an article that you wrote that was talking about voice cloning. So let's start there. What exactly is that?
So what voice cloning is the use of technology, and that technology is used to create a synthetic copy of someone's voice and speech pattern based on a sample audio recording.
We're seeing a rise in the number of people who are victims of voice cloning. In fact, I was reading a report from CNN that said that potentially millions of people could be affected by voice cloning in terms of scams. So can you talk a little bit about some examples of how voice cloning is being exploited?
So the fact that there is technology that exists to copy someone's voice and used to create convincing audio clips of them can be exploited in numerous ways, as I'm sure you can imagine. So in the piece that you referenced, we provided an example from pop culture in which a song called Nostalgia went viral on the internet a few years ago. And what this song did was it used voice cloning technology to create synthetic copies of the voices of Justin Bieber, Bad Bunny, and Daddy Yankee. After that, there were reports from the media that Bad Bunny became particularly upset that the song that he was never part of, but incorporated the likeness of his voice, was circulating all over the internet. Interestingly, the same thing happened to Celine Dion. More recently, a few months ago, she issued a statement that there were unsanctioned AI-generated music purporting to contain her name and likeness that was also circulating over the internet. And so obviously, these two examples involve celebrities who are famous for their voices, which are being exploited without their consent. That being said, we can imagine situations where this could also happen on a day-to-day basis as well. So for example, a voice clone could be used to generate the voice of a loved one to extract money, for example, or for some other improper purpose. And so there are really limitless number of examples in which voice cloning could be used to exploit others.
One of the things that I think is especially worrisome, and I've talked to a number of people who have been victim of these voice clones, is that it's really hard to detect them. And what I mean by that is if you are sent a voice message from someone who sounds exactly like a loved one or sounds exactly like a celebrity, unlike past digital scams where we could actually figure out, okay, this is actually a scam, this is what to do, these are nearly impossible for the average person to detect. Do you think that's one of the issues that we face right now that is making this potentially such a big problem?
Oh, absolutely. It's really hard to tell, and the technology is probably advancing every day. And so that's certainly one of the issues.
And I think there's a lot of awareness about deepfake video, which certainly is on the rise. And I would love to talk to you about that as well. And maybe fewer examples of deepfake audio. But the thing I want to know, which I think is unclear to a lot of Canadians, is what exactly are the laws around both deepfake audio and deepfake video if you are a victim of someone who is targeting you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so it's a bit of a legal patchwork currently in Canada. It seems that victims, however, will probably have some sort of civil recourse, whether that's a potential claim under privacy legislation in the common law, which is the law that's created through court decisions, or potentially both. And so there's three general categories that we'll talk about today that would be applicable to deepfakes as well as voice cloning. So the first is the violation of privacy statutory claims. And so the legislation is provincial. It's not identical across provinces, and not all provinces have it. But generally speaking, it would be a claim under the legislation that pertains to the violation of one's privacy. It's centered on the protection against the unauthorized use of one's likeness. And generally speaking, the language is broad enough to capture a variety of wrongful acts. There is some specific legislation that specifically references the use of one's voice or the misuse of one's voice. So that's the first potential area in which a claim could be brought. The other two are common law claims, and they're called appropriation of personality as well as false light. Appropriation of personality is essentially the exploitation of one's personality for a commercial purpose without their consent.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about that specifically. When you say commercial purpose, would that imply that someone is potentially trying to make money from these videos or these audio files, which of course is not always the case, correct?
That's right. Yeah. So commercial purpose, it's sort of broad, and really the key question is the purpose primarily for commercial exploitation? And with many things with the law, it is really based on what the facts are, right? So the question is, what is the primary purpose of this act?
When we look around the world and look at some of the laws that have been enacted in terms of protecting people from deep fakes, there are some regions that are much more advanced in terms of having those rules and regulations in place. If we look to the EU as one example, also China, why is it taking us so long to be more specific with the laws around this in Canada?
So I would say that generally speaking, the law evolves as there are societal changes, right? So cases that are being brought to the court and litigated reflect what is happening in real life. And so in Canada, the law is emerging in this area. So like I mentioned, there are provinces which have these pieces of privacy legislation creating these statutory claims potentially for victims of deepfake or audio cloning. Currently, as I mentioned, it is kind of a patchwork, so the law is not consistent across the Canadian provinces. I say not currently. But do I think that the law will continue to develop as we see the proliferation of voice clones and deepfakes? I think that seems likely because as things happen, that's how law develops.
It's interesting, and I think during this election cycle, I think more people are becoming aware of deepfakes, in particular how they are affecting potential voters. We've seen an example for an instance on Meta where there are advertisers who are actually advertising deepfakes of one of the main political leaders. This type of awareness, I would hope, is in some ways good for the average Canadian to understand how prevalent this is. But at the same time, it is a bit worrisome that people are going out and paying for advertisements that are featuring these deep fake videos. So what would you say to people who stumble across one of these videos, or maybe they are victims themselves?
Yeah, so what I would say is I think, like with many things on the internet, it's good to be critical of what you're seeing and hearing. If you yourself think that you might be a victim of a deepfake, or if you know that you are because you've seen it, then it's really important to act quickly, especially when things are floating around on the internet. It can spread really quickly, right? And so there is a need to take quick action.
I think one of the confusing things for a lot of Canadians is that they may look at deepfake videos and audio that are impersonating celebrities, and they may sort of understand the intention of that. They may look at deepfake videos and audio that is targeting politicians, and they understand the intent of that to create chaos. But there's also this third category, which is non-consensual porn, which more and more is an issue, especially for young people, where you see that most often it's either women or girls who are depicted in these videos. When you look at something like that, do you think that we need tougher laws around this?
I think the law in Canada currently is really centered on the protection of one's image or likeness, as well as one's ability to use it. And so in my view, I think generally speaking, the law is in terms of the legislation, pretty broad in terms of the statutory language to capture all types of wrongful acts. And so, I think it is a difficult issue to talk about for many people. It is obviously like something very upsetting that can happen, but the crux is really the protection of one's image or likeness, right? And that can capture a variety of different circumstances.
Excellent. Well, listen, for people who want to read more about this issue, where's the best place for them to go? I know your company has some information over on your website.
Yeah. Well, anyone who's interested about reading further can certainly visit our website. If you look me up on our website, you'll see a hyperlink to our past publications, the one that we were speaking about today, as well as a variety of other publications relating to these issues.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Karina and Amber. That's all for today's show. This is our 10th episode since we launched back in February, and we've got lots more coming up.
Thanks for listening to the Amber Mac Show, and as always, you can find our video segments and interviews online over on YouTube at Amber Mac. Also, before we go, we had a question from Evan on Threads that we want to take a couple of minutes to answer. Evan mentioned that he might be traveling to the US in the near future, so he's curious about buying a burner phone and plan, and he's looking for some articles on the topic. We did a quick search, and there are 3 really helpful posts online. First up, Bloomberg recently reported that major public institutions in Canada, including a pension management firm and a leading hospital, are advising staff against traveling to the U.S., marking a greater erosion in the country's long-standing trust with its neighbor. The Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, one of Canada's top pediatric research hospitals, is recommending its staff avoid U.S. trips. As they say, due to the escalation of issues and volatility in the U.S., CHEO strongly encourages individuals to refrain from travel to that country at this time. In other words, Evan, you're not alone here when it comes to thinking about your upcoming trip south of the border. Just a few days ago, Gizmodo reported that the European Commission has started issuing burner phones and stripped-down laptops to staff visiting the U.S. over concerns that the treatment of visitors to the country has become a security risk. This is in the wake of news that some researchers entering the United States were denied access after U.S. border agents found text messages on their phones that were critical of the president. To unpack this topic a little bit further, CNET has an excellent breakdown on how a burner phone works and where to get one. As CNET explains, a burner phone is a cheap prepaid phone with no commitments. It comes with a set number of prepaid call minutes, text messages, or data, and is designed to be disposed of after use. Now, they go on to explain that you don't have to actually throw your burner away, but you can, of course, simply add more minutes and keep using it. Beyond the challenges traveling to the US right now, a burner phone is a good idea when you're on a trip, even if you're just using it as a secondary device. CNET explains the difference between prepaid phones, smartphones, and burner SIMs. There are plenty of places in Canada where you can get prepaid phones, including Best Buy as one example. As CNET explains, and I quote, all burner phones are prepaid phones, but not all prepaid phones are burners. What sets a burner apart is that you will not have to give away any personal information to get one, and it won't be traceable back to you. If you're not worried about the traceability, but you just want a clean phone for travel, another option is an inexpensive smartphone with a separate plan. Evan, we hope that this is helpful, and thank you so much for your question. If you have a topic you want us to cover on the show, please do let us know online. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.
The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.